I'm Lil.
And I'm Fitz.
And you're listening to Knock Once for Yes. We're bringing you a slightly different episode this time. We're breaking out of our usual format to give our Screaming Skulls special feature the space it deserves. Now don't worry, you can still get all of your favourite true listener ghost stories and chat in episode 61, which we've released as a whole episode of its own. And this, episode 62, is entirely dedicated to a deep dive into the strange tales of Screaming Skulls. So, without further ado, on with the show.
Screaming skulls seem to be a largely British phenomena. It's a curious tradition in which manor houses and farmsteads dotted across the country have resident skulls that legend says will kick up a bit of a ruckus if they're ever removed. Some are hidden, bricked up within ancient walls. Others are displayed prominently. Some seem to want nothing more than to remain as they are, seen and remembered, not buried and forgotten. Others warn of danger or tragedy, and some torment those who have done them wrong. The common theme, though, seems to be that should they not have their wishes fulfilled, they will let their displeasure be known through wailing and screaming during the dark of night. Like many paranormal phenomena, my first introduction to Screaming Skulls came from the ever-dependable Usborne book, World of the Unknown Ghosts. In fact, the cover of the book itself featured an illustration of a human skull engulfed in flame that, to my young mind at least, seemed the most sinister image of those that adorned the cover. But terrifying or fascinating, there's something rather captivating about the human skull. Poetry and literature are wont to seat our passions and desires in the heart, leaving only cold rationality to our brain. And yet, a preserved human heart, such as the one we encountered at Woodford Church, doesn't give the same unnerving sense of being observed in return that a skull gives. And this is perhaps one reason why we have such a fascination with skulls. Though they lack the details that allow us to read expressions, we still innately recognize them as of us. A full skull will grin at us, and even a jawless skull will observe us. The dark, empty eye sockets still somehow convey the cognition of the mind that once occupied them. Human skulls are so clearly a part of us that their image is used time and again as a warning, be that the flags of pirates or the warning symbols for poison and toxicity. They are a clear reminder of our own mortality.
One of the reasons that the Screaming Skulls phenomena has become so deeply rooted in British paranormal history is likely thanks to the writers of the 19th century, during which time the first collections of Screaming Skull legends began to be published, setting the scene for a slew of skull-related paranormal phenomena working its way into the ghost stories of the 20th century and beyond. In the popular ghost stories that grew out of these legends, several common themes emerged. The skulls often belonged to people who had suffered a violent death and were either vengeful in nature or had unfinished business. A theme which, incidentally, also neatly fitted most Victorian ghost story tropes. The skulls in these stories were continually being disposed of by the owners in the properties in which they resided, by burying, burning, smashing, or, quite commonly, being thrown into a moat or some other body of water. But every attempt to destroy them was unsuccessful, and every time they would inexplicably reappear of their own volition. And, of course, the thing that gives them their collective name. If moved from their favourite spot, oftentimes a window that they like to look out from in life, all manner of supernatural phenomena would ensue, including the sounds of unearthly howls, screams and wails, poltergeist activity, even wind and lightning storms, all of which could only be remedied by the skull being returned to its rightful place. So, how much truth is there to these legends? Where did they come from? And are they as sinister as they sound? Well, we're going to find out as we take you on an exploration of a few of the cases famously named as Screaming Skulls. And our first stop on this whirlwind tour of Screaming Skulls takes us to the small village of Chiltern-Canterlow in Somerset. Like so many of its size, the village is clustered around one main street, upon which you can find the Church of St James with its 15th century stone tower and Higher Farm, two buildings inextricably linked by a local legend that has endured for over 200 years. On one side of the street, in the north end of St James Church, there's a memorial to the person at the centre of this strange tale, the rather wonderfully named Theophilus Broome. The stone itself gives no hint of the peculiar tale that has arisen around the man in question, but it does speak to his good character. Here lieth the body of Theophilus Broome, of the Broomes of the House of Woodlows near Warwick Town in the county of Warwick, who deceased the 18th of August 1670, aged 69. A man just in the actions of his life, true to his friends, forgave those that wronged him, and died in peace. Any modern visitor to the church would probably think no more of the stone, except maybe that the person whom it remembers must have been well respected. But this stone is at the centre of a long tradition in the village, a tale well known by locals many years ago, but one that would have been in danger of dying out, just like so many others that have been lost along the centuries, were it not for cleric, antiquarian, and county historian John Collinson and his 1791 magnum opus, The History and Antiquities of Somerset. Collinson's work is noted for containing valuable records of church monument inscriptions, and Theophilus Broome's was amongst those that he recorded. But that wasn't all Collinson wrote about the stone. He also made note of the story that accompanied the innocent-looking memorial, unwittingly authoring one of the first records of a screaming skull. There is a tradition in this parish that the person here interred requested that his head might be taken off before his burial and be preserved at the farmhouse near the church, where a head, chop fallen enough, is still shown, which the tenants of the house have often endeavoured to commit to the bowels of the earth, but have, as often, been deterred by horrid noises portentive of sad displeasure. And about 20 years since, which was perhaps the last attempt, the sexton, in digging a place for the skull's repository, broke the spade in 2 pieces and uttered a solemn asseveration never more to attempt an act so evidently repugnant to the quiet of Broome's head. Reading this 18th century writing, one might be inclined to think to oneself, no wonder the locals remember the story so well and for so long, for it's a delightfully chilling morsel of folklore to savour whilst huddled up around a winter's fire on a cold, dark night. And you'd be right, but it's equally likely that the tale took such a foothold in village tradition because the skull wasn't merely folklore. A very real skull, just as Collinson described it, was kept securely in a case at the farmhouse just across the road from the church. And, even more incredibly, it's still there to this day. There are even images of it in situ, black and white photos showing a toothless skull with wide eye sockets, uncannily seeming to look straight into the camera lens from its cupboard above the farmhouse doorway where it is said to still reside. So, with this in mind, we can safely assume that no subsequent owner of the farmhouse has succeeded in burying or otherwise getting rid of the skull. But how many others have tried? Well, in later years we don't have such meticulous records as John Collinson kept. But we certainly do have a slew of stories relating to people moving, manhandling, or otherwise disrespecting the skull. It's said that the most common consequence of upsetting the skull by moving it is that of poltergeist activity, with some reports claiming that frightful screams would be heard. Other accounts are more sinister, with one claiming that a man, whilst attempting to bury the skull on church grounds, was swiftly stopped in his task when he was hit in the head and killed by slate tiles falling from the church roof. I found reports cited as being taken from Peter Underwood's book, Ghosts of Somerset, in which Underwood tells the stories of two researchers in the 1970s who visited the farmhouse to view the skull and made the mistake of mocking it. The researchers would later regret their behaviour when one of them suffered a car accident on his way home and another suffered burns when he dropped a cigarette into his clothing. Apparently both men were convinced their misfortune was the direct result of their disrespect to the skull. Other reports are somewhat confused. One in particular speaks of some workmen at the farmhouse using the skull as a drinking vessel to celebrate the completion of their work by quaffing beer from the upturned cranium. In some retellings, this was said to have resulted in strange noises and activity, whilst in others, the beer-fueled merriment apparently elicited no retribution from Theophilus, leading some to believe that it's only those who mock him or try and take him away from his place of residence who invoke his wrath. Or, possibly, that old Theophilus just liked a pint or two and wasn't disinclined to be included in the celebrations. By all accounts, there must be many more reports of the activity attributed to the skull than we have been able to find, because it's documented that alongside the skull, the farmhouse has a manuscript dating from 1829, containing the statements of parishioners recording the legend and detailing the supernatural activity that had occurred when attempts were made to move the skull from the house. Even by the 1880s, the potential consequences of disrespecting the skull's wishes were notorious and widely known. A newspaper article in the Southern Times and Dorset County Herald from 1883 responds to a reader of the paper who had evidently expressed a wish to be rid of the skull from the farmhouse, to which a respondent makes quite clear that they would be bringing ill fortune down on themselves were they to undertake such a fool's errand, with this response. The reader's wish to remove the skull and brave the consequences, i.e., the destruction of a house which does not belong to him, is perhaps more disinterested than it would at first sight appear, as those consequences are, by local tradition, reported to be disastrous to the person removing the skull, but not to affect the house from which it is removed. At one time, the identity of the legendary skull was thrown into question when locals began to wonder whether the farmhouse relic really did belong to the now legendary Theophilus Broome, or if the stone in the church simply provided a handy character to assign to the enigmatic skull. But during renovation works of the church between 1864 and 1866, the crypt where Broome's body was interred was opened. Obviously, such an opportunity to settle the debate once and for all wasn't going to be wasted, and when Broome's body was examined, it was confirmed that he was indeed missing his head, and thus the legend was forever cemented in the hearts and minds of the good people of Chiltern Canterlow. But who was Broome? And bearing in mind how his memorial stone speaks so highly of his character and generosity of forgiveness, what would make such a man wreak vengeance upon future generations? And, well, perhaps the first question should be, why on earth did he want to be buried without his head? According to local tradition, Theophilus Broome was a soldier in the English Civil War on the side of the Royalists. a detail which is apparently supported by the arms engraved on his tomb in the church. However, the story goes that Broome defected from the Royalists to join the parliamentarian side after becoming disgusted at the brutal treatment of the Roundhead prisoners by the king's men, which does seem to bear out the man of good conscience memorialised on his stone in the church. Broome managed to survive the war, and for a while he was on the winning side, but only 11 years after Oliver Cromwell led the parliamentarians to victory and executed the king, Cromwell's son, appointed Lord Protector after his father's death, was overthrown, and the monarchy was restored. In 1661, on the anniversary of his father's execution, Charles II would have his revenge on Cromwell, even though Cromwell was already dead, having died of natural causes 3 years earlier. That didn't deter the newly restored king, though. He had Cromwell and his right-hand men exhumed, tried, and found guilty of treason. Despite the fact that they were long dead, their punishments were still enacted, and they were hung in chains from Tyburn gallows before being beheaded, their bodies thrown into pits, and their heads mounted on tall spikes outside Westminster Hall as a warning to any other would-be traitors to the crown. So, with Theophilus Broome having defected from the Royalist cause, it was perhaps understandable that the restoration of the monarchy and the return to power of Royalist sympathisers caused him some concern. We're not sure if this is the reason that he left his home county of Warwickshire to stay with his sister in Somerset, but it is certainly cited as the reason that he made such a strange request on his deathbed. With the exhumation, beheading, and public display of Cromwell's body 9 years earlier, it's not too much of a stretch to imagine that Broome was more than a little concerned about keeping his own head safe and away from the hands of vengeful royalists after he passed away. So it's widely believed that he asked his sister to save him from a similar fate by keeping his head safe at the farmhouse, denying any tomb robbers the satisfaction of being able to separate his head from his body and save him the indignity of being publicly displayed as a traitor. And it seems that his sister did just that, respecting his wishes and keeping his head safe within the farmhouse for the rest of her days. So we can see that Theophilus Broome had good reason to want to stay in the farmhouse, and in life and death, it was very important to him that his wish was respected. We can understand why he might kick up a racket if anyone tried to move him. But is he really the sort to wreak vengeance upon those who disrespected his skull? His memorial certainly doesn't seem to point to that kind of temperament. While the current residents of the farmhouse and guardians of Theophilus Broome's skull would seem to agree with the latter. The present occupants of the farmhouse are Mr. and Mrs. Curtin, and Mr. Curtin, who was born in the farmhouse, has known and respected Broome's skull all his life. Mr. Curtin's wife admitted to having some initial reservations about moving in with the relic, and is reported to have confirmed in Underwood's Ghosts of Somerset that there were strange occurrences if the skull was moved. But she seems to have overcome her worries, and is quoted as saying, "People expect me to be frightened, but I know that, provided he's not taken outside the house, he would never do me any harm. He doesn't like being handled too much. If he objects, he'd soon let us know. But as long as he's treated with respect, he never causes trouble." In a recent webinar, Caroline McKendrick from the Association for the Scientific Study of Anomalous Phenomena related how she, a local to the village of Chilton Canterlow, had spoken with Mr. Curtin, whose family had been at the farm for decades. He viewed the skull as a guardian, a protector spirit, and thought that the reports of retributions enacted by the skull as being extremely unlikely and out of character, and even viewed the claims of its screams upon being moved as a little far-fetched. That said, he didn't deny that strange things would occur if the skull were moved, or that Theophilus would make his feelings known if he were upset. But he seemed very much to regard the skull as part of the family, an elder who was to be valued, and their wishes not to be taken lightly. He is quoted as saying, "My family have lived here for 75 years, and he's always been a quiet and respected gentleman." So, quite a fascinating story really, but maybe not the unquiet and vengeful screaming skull we know from the popularised ghost stories of the 19th and 20th centuries. But let's look at another case, one of the more famous screaming skulls cases and one whose origins has caused much confusion and controversy: the skull of Bettiscombe Manor.
Bettiscombe is an unassuming manor house, quietly tucked away down a discreet lane in the village of the same name in the county of Dorset. From the outside, it's an unpretentious example of a two-winged country manor, with 18th and 17th century additions thought to hide a 16th century core. Bettiscombe was the family seat of the Pinney family until 1985, and the last of the Pinneys to live at Bettiscombe House did so until 2001. The story of the screaming skull of Bettiscombe seems to have first been brought to the general public's attention through the writings of one John Simmons Udall, an interesting figure in his own right, being an accomplished cricketer, lawyer and judge who served as both the Attorney General of Fiji and the Chief Justice of the Leeward Isles. But our interest aligns with his fascination with antiquities, and particularly in his studies into the history, folklore and customs of Dorset. He shares the story of the preserved human skull at Bettiscombe, which had then been resident there for at least a generation, in the scholarly journal Notes and Queries published in 1872, along with the warning that, if it be brought out of the house itself would rock to its foundations, whilst the person by whom such an act of desecration was committed would certainly die within the year. He also comments that the warning seems to have been taken quite seriously by the residents of the manor, as, through many changes of tenancy and furniture, the skull still holds its accustomed place, unmoved and unremoved. So, to whom did the skull belong, and why would they be so strongly inclined for their remains to remain at Bettiscombe? Well, as commonly told and is recounted to Udall, the story features not the owner of the house at the time, Nathaniel, but his brother Azariah, who was a member of the Monmouth Rebellion in 1685, an attempt to depose King James II of England and Ireland, and for our Scottish listeners, King James VII. Azariah was taken prisoner following the final battle of the Monmouth Rebellion, the Battle of Sedgemoor. Like many others, Azariah was sentenced to death by drawing and quartering during the bloody assizes, but he managed to dodge this fate following the payment of a £65 ransom, which, in case you were wondering, is about £15,000 in today's money. Instead of death and dismemberment, not necessarily in that order, Azariah found himself enslaved and shipped off to the West Indies. Despite this, he somehow managed to become a successful businessman and plantation owner on the Caribbean island of Nevis. He also appears to have lacked both empathy and morals, as even his own enslavement didn't deter him from enslaving others, even if the original text attempts to downplay the heinousness of it by saying he employed his own slaves. The story continues that in 1783, one of Azariah's descendants was to return to Bettiscombe, accompanied by a faithful manservant, and I very much hope that you could hear the sarcasm in my voice there. This manservant was named Bettiscombe, and I think we can safely assume that this was not a name chosen for him by his parents. The poor man, a slave in all but name, was torn from the country of his birth and struggled to acclimatise to the cooler and damper climes of England, falling ill with tuberculosis and passing away soon after his arrival. Lying on his deathbed, he let it be known that his wish was for his body to be returned to his homeland for burial, and if his wish was to be ignored, the house would have no peace. Of course, the Pinneys were as receptive to his wishes in death as they were in his life, and buried his body in the local churchyard. It would seem, though, that his threat was not an idle one, and soon the manor was plagued with unexplained events, and the halls and corridors resonated with unearthly wails and screams until the terrified Pinneys exhumed the body and brought his bones to Bettiscombe. Whether they had then originally intended to ship the bones to his homeland, the story doesn't say, but as soon as the remains arrived at Bettiscombe, the supernatural lamentations ceased, and whilst the majority of the skeleton is no longer evident, the owners of Bettiscombe since then have not dared to test the legend, and the skull remains there to this day. Except, while it does seem to be the case that the skull is indeed still at Bettiscombe, much of the rest of the story is at best confused or unknown, and at worst completely untrue. In some versions it was Azariah himself that returned from Nevis to Bettiscombe, in some his son, and in others a more distant relative. In some versions the wailing, screaming and moaning was heard at the churchyard instead of the manor, and the Pinneys were forced by the local villagers to exhume the body to appease them, rather than from their own fear at the haunting of the manor. Now, our antiquarian, John Simmons Udall, suspected that the skull was not who legend supposed it to be. He seems to have become quite invested in the story and researched it thoroughly over the course of 30-odd years, even going so far as to travel to Nevis and visit the plantation that once belonged to Pinney. He suspected that the skull was that of a woman, but his investigation, much like mine, seemed to pose more questions than answers. He discovered evidence that there may have been more than one Azariah Pinney, who also had a brother called John, and who was executed during the bloody assizes rather than being enslaved and sent to work on a plantation in the West Indies. However, our Azariah was indeed sent there and did rise to the status of plantation owner. Udall even found a memorial to John Pinney, the only son and heir of Azariah Pinney, which bore the family crest of the Pinneys of Bettiscombe at the Fig Tree Church on the island of Nevis, near to the Pinney plantation. The Pinneys really seem to be particularly fond of the name John, as Azariah, as well as having a father called John and a son and a brother called John, also had a cousin of that name, who was the MP for Bridport, and who inherited the Bettiscombe estate from Azariah's son. When this John Pinney died, he left Bettiscombe to his nephew John Prater, who decided there weren't enough John Pinneys already and changed his surname to take up the mantle himself. And if I read the records correctly, he even named his own son John, apparently to make things even more confusing for people several hundred years later desperately trying to work out who any given reference to John Pinney might relate to. So, with a confusing number of John Pinneys on record, did one of them return to Bettiscombe Manor with a so-called manservant called Bettiscombe? There is a Bettiscombe in the Pinney plantation records, but he was long dead by the time John, whichever one it was, returned to England. And yet, here we're thrown another curveball, for Udall also came across another local version of the legend, which relates that John returned to England with both a faithful servant and the skull of the servant of his dead brother, as you do, apparently. So could this skull be that of Bettiscombe after all? It seems not. A forensic analysis was carried out in the 1960s that confirmed the skull was that of a prehistoric woman, aged around 25 to 30, of European descent, quite likely taken from one of the nearby prehistoric burial mounds. It also showed signs of being submerged underwater for some time, possibly even deliberately placed as an offering to the local water spirits. So, if John did return with a skull and/or a manservant from the West Indies, it appears that the screaming skull of Bettiscombe Manor belonged to neither of them, and the confusing stories surrounding it have been somewhat embellished through retelling.
Of course, at the mere mention of a prehistoric burial, I got very excited and went straight to my beloved maps to see what clues I could see in the landscape to verify this exciting possibility. And, sure enough, only 1 mile from the manor, contour lines indicate a regular, flat-topped mound marked with the words Fort and Tumuli. This is Pilsdon Pen, an Iron Age hill fort with an even older Bronze Age burial mound at its summit, telling us that the site had been a place of great importance even before the Iron Age hill fort was established. Knowing this makes it really quite plausible that the skull could in fact be from a female Bronze Age inhabitant of the area. Even more interestingly, when I looked for details of the burial mounds, I discovered reports that they had been partially disturbed by medieval farming. All of a sudden, we're not even looking for grave robbers digging up ancient burial sites, but potentially just a local person accidentally tripping over a dislodged skull whilst out for a walk. Even so, though, I don't think I even need to give our usual warnings here about taking artifacts from historical sites. You would think that most people would realise that picking up a displaced human skull and taking it home wouldn't be a very good idea. Well, it seems likely that one inhabitant of Bettiscombe Manor had no such compunctions, and by all accounts, the owners of the manor would be paying the price for generations to come. It's not actually possible to go and visit Bettiscombe Manor, where the skull does still apparently reside. These days, the house is privately owned by the famous designer Jasper Conrad. But if you subscribe to the theory that the skull may actually belong to a Bronze Age inhabitant once interred in an ancient hill fort, you absolutely can go and visit Pilsdon Pen, which is owned by the National Trust and apparently has spectacular views over the Quantock Hills and even Dartmoor on a clear day. And let's face it, it's always worth a visit to an ancient hill fort. Just make sure the only thing you take home with you is your rubbish.
These first 2 accounts do seem to contain a lot of the classic themes attributed to the Screaming Skull legends, but that's certainly not the case for every skull labelled as such. In fact, some of them aren't even reputed to scream at all. I think it's safe to say that a wide variety of skull legends were lumped together long before the term Screaming Skull was even coined, and have simply remained so, even if the very descriptor implied by the label given to them later isn't present in their story. This lumping together may have caused some cross-pollination between local legends. The stories and details from one story have ended up in another, and minor details have become rather embellished through repeated retelling. In fact, it doesn't even seem to be the screaming aspect that matters so much to each case being included under the umbrella of this phenomena. There are other threads that tie them all together, common themes that we see repeatedly cropping up, and another major theme is that of reappearing skulls. In many Screaming Skull cases that we found, the main common denominator doesn't actually seem to be that they scream, but that no matter how many attempts there are at displacing or disposing of them, they somehow mysteriously reappear. There are a couple of very famous screaming skull cases from the Lake District in the north of England, both of which would be more aptly described as reappearing skulls. The first took place at Threlkeld Place, farmstead in Cumbria, when a new tenant to the farm found a human skull in one of the rooms and decided to honour it with a respectful burial. Having done so, he was shocked to find on his return that the skull had reappeared in the very same room in which he had originally found it. At a bit of a loss, he decided to undertake the nearly 40-mile journey to St. Bees Head on the coast and throw the skull into the sea to be rid of it. But once again, on his return, it sat in its accustomed place in the farmstead. This time, the tenant decided discretion was the better part of valour and bricked up the whole room containing the skull instead. That's one way of dealing with it, I suppose.
A more well-documented case is that of Calgarth Hall, where not one but two skulls were reported to be at the centre of unexplained phenomena that became the subject of local folklore for centuries to come. Calgarth, as it currently stands, is a Georgian-style lakeland villa close to the banks of Lake Windermere, and, like many grand historic homes, it's gone through several extensions and renovations since its original construction. It's presently in use as retirement flats, but prior to this, it had stood empty since the 1960s, when the hospital that had operated there since 1920 closed down. More pertinent for our story, though, was that it was the family seat of the Philipson family from the early 15th century until 1717. The story of the screaming skulls of Calgarth Hall seems to have been common knowledge, at least locally, by the 18th century, and the villain of the piece is said to be either Robin Philipson, as recounted by James Clark in his survey of the lakes in 1789, or Miles Philipson, as recounted in verse by Alexander Craig Gibson, a folklorist, in his, concisely named, The Folk Speech of Cumberland and Some Districts Adjacent, being short stories and rhymes in the dialect of the West Border counties in 1869. Oh, that is quite a title. The original tale he claims he heard from a former ferryman on Lake Windermere. But be it Robin or Miles, Mr. Philipson was a local magistrate and landowner, and he had his eye on the bit of land known as Calgarth. Currently residing there was a farmer known as Craster Cook and his wife Dorothy, who had no intention of letting Philipson get his grubby hands on their property, and repeatedly rebuffed the magistrate's attempt at purchasing it. Having failed in his initial attempt to obtain the land legally, he resorted to subterfuge, and whilst outwardly appearing friendly to the Cooks, he set about plotting a convenient demise for them. His plan came to fruition at Christmas time, when the Cooks were invited to his home for a large banquet he put on for his neighbours. So far, so neighbourly, but it was, of course, all a ruse, and, following the banquet, Philipson accused the Cooks of stealing a silver cup, which was later discovered at their home at Calgarth, having obviously been planted there by Philipson. Being the magistrate, though, Philipson was able to use his position to sentence them to death for the theft. The Cooks may not have had any power to defend themselves against Philipson's evil greed in this life, but they were determined to make him pay for his crimes, even if it meant they had to do it from beyond the grave. At the pronouncement of their sentence, Dorothy rose and ominously intoned, "Guard thyself, Miles Philipson. Thou thinkest thou hast managed grandly, but that tiny lump of land is the dearest a Philipson has ever bought or stolen. For you will never prosper, neither your breed. Whatever scheme you undertake will wither in your hand. The side you take will always lose. The time shall come when no Philipson will own an inch of land. And while Calgarth walls shall stand, we'll haunt it night and day. Never will you be rid of us." This evidently didn't deter Philipson, who wasted no time in demolishing the Cook's farmhouse, commencing work to build a grand new house on their land at Calgarth, even whilst the bodies of its rightful owners were still hanging from the scaffold. Having completed the house by the following Christmas, and again inviting neighbours for a celebratory banquet, although I have to say I'm surprised any of them attended after 2 of the last partygoers ended up on the scaffold, but during the party his wife happened to head upstairs and was horrified to find 2 skulls waiting for her at the top of the steps. We have no idea how on earth Philipson explained this away to his wife, but he hurriedly had the skulls buried and tried to forget the whole matter. The skulls, however, were having none of it, and promptly returned to their chosen spot at the top of Philipson's shiny new staircase. Philipson tried again and again to be rid of them, burning them, crushing them, throwing them in the lake, but each time they returned unharmed. As well as simply being an unnerving presence in the house, it seems that Dorothy made good on her promise to be the ruin of Philipson and his family. He was plagued with misfortune, which apparently delighted the Skulls, as they were said to have greeted news of each disaster with wild laughter. Eventually, Philipson lost both land and hall, and as he progressively fell further into ruin, the Skulls were said to have become quieter, though not silent, until the Bishop of Llandaff later purchased the property. He performed an exorcism and removed the skulls from display. Local legend says that the skulls were bricked up in a wall, but even hidden, they apparently still make their presence felt. Peter Underwood records in his 1986 Ghost Hunter's Guide that there is a weird atmosphere, odd noises and movement of windows, doors and electrical switches. Similar incidents having been reported by many people over many years. In his book, Strange Pages from Family Papers, in 1895, Thomas Firminger Thistleton Dyer posits a slightly more mundane explanation for the presence of the skulls. He states that some local historians claim a female doctor, or as they put it, a doctress, not a term I'd ever heard before, used to live at the house and had a pair of skeletons, according to their quote, for the usual purposes of her profession, and that the skulls were simply better preserved than the other bones, so it was simply their unusual presence that caused the folklore to arise. This does add a rather different angle to the story, but of course it doesn't necessarily discount the paranormal phenomena that occurred around them. Sometimes I wonder whether the more elaborate legends emerge just because the true and often mundane origin stories for these skulls just don't seem to offer a dramatic enough basis for the strange supernatural events that surround them. Well, we don't have to travel very far at all to find our next screaming skull. One thing we've noticed that isn't often discussed about these skull stories is that they overwhelmingly seem to take place in the north of England, with a few notable exceptions. But for our next case, we will remain in the Lake District, in Penrith, Cumbria to be exact. And yes, this one is actually reputed to scream.
This story takes place at Brougham Hall, which, in case any of you fancy looking it up, is actually spelled Brougham, Brougham. Having looked into Brougham Hall, it's rapidly topping the list of places I'd quite like to visit, as it's apparently teeming with ghosts, including a tall, wheezing man with piercing eyes that startles female visitors and staff by touching them and whispering in their ears, shadow figures, the sound of footsteps and laughter, items that move of their own accord, and the sounds of battle which can be heard both in the hall and on the grounds at night. But for today, we'll just focus on their most well-known paranormal story, that of their screaming skull. Legend passed down through the Broome family tells that the skull was that of a dead warrior who was interred in the walls of the hall in order to bring good luck and prosperity to its residents. The skull certainly seems to have taken his duties as a guardian of the property seriously, as the legend goes on to say that on one occasion the skull was removed from its interment and the hall echoed with howls of torment and was plagued with poltergeist activity until the skull was returned. Unsurprisingly, nobody seems to have tried to move it again, so there it remains to this day, and perhaps has even been joined by another spiritual protector. You see, we're quite lucky that Brougham Hall still stands at all, as it had fallen into a derelict state following its last real use as a tank development facility in the Second World War. A sad state of affairs for a site that had been lived on at least as far back as the Roman occupation of Britain. There were numerous plans to demolish and replace it over the years, but fortunately Christopher and Alison Terry stepped in to save it when they purchased it in 1967 and worked to halt its decline and renovate the property. Sadly, Christopher passed away in 2016, but his work continues through a charitable trust, and Christopher himself is interred in the grounds close to the tower that he once used as an office. Perhaps he wanted his remains to stay at the site so he could watch over it too, much like the skull of the warrior. Before his passing, the author of Ghostly Cumbria, Rob Kirkup, asked Christopher if there was any truth to the tales of the skull, to which he replied, "I can certainly vouch for the existence of the skull, because during the restoration process we came across it. It was very green in colour. We made sure it was reinterred within the 58-inch thick wall, exactly where we'd found it. The skull had been poleaxed. There was an equilateral triangle of small holes in the top of the skull. I showed the skull to my dentist, and it was the skull of a male aged around 35 years old. There is even now a stone epitaph with an inscription marking the location, copied from an even earlier one that reads, "Unknown soldier from a sunlit shore, who paid the price in an unknown war. For an unknown god in an unknown time, may peace eternal now be thine. Pray lie within this ancient wall, and guard that it should never fall."
So this story is a bit of an interesting departure from the Screaming Skulls archetype of the 19th century writers. It certainly has enough of the common themes, in that it mustn't be removed from the property, and to do so will invoke supernatural wails and screams of lament until the skull is replaced. But what's different here is that it's made quite clear the skull is a protector spirit, a guardian of the house. We don't have the themes of a wronged, malicious spirit that we do in so many of the others. But actually, when you start really drilling down into the individual Screaming Skulls legends, we seem to keep finding that this idea of the wronged, vengeful spirit of the skull is maybe not so prevalent after all. In fact, many of them, when you get into the history behind the legend, seem to point to the skull starting out, much like the unknown soldier at Brougham Hall, as a protective, guardian talisman. But whether guardians or vengeful spirits, In most of these stories, the original owner of the skull is usually a mystery, or at best, ambiguous. Not so in our next case, for which we will remain in the north of England, but travelling east this time, to Yorkshire and Burton Agnes Hall.
The grand Elizabethan manor house of Burton Agnes Hall, built by Sir Henry Griffith, was completed in 1610, and was much beloved by Sir Henry's youngest daughter Catherine, who often went by her baptismal name of Anne. She believed the manor to be the most beautiful house ever built, but sadly, Catherine was not to have long to appreciate its beauty. According to John Henry Ingram in his work The Haunted Homes and Family Traditions of Great Britain, shortly after its completion, Catherine visited some friends in nearby Brougham Hall and was stopped on her return later that evening by a pair of beggars. Apparently, this was a common occurrence at the time, as where once the now dissolved monasteries would offer alms to the poor, now they were forced to rely on, or even demand using threats of violence, the charity of others. She fished a few coins from her purse for them, but in doing so, unfortunately drew their attention to a ring that she wore, which was a family heirloom and most dear to her. They demanded the ring as well as the coins, but feeling confidently close to aid, she refused them and cried out for help when they attempted to take it by force. Fearing capture, her assailants struck her in the head with a stick to quiet her shouts, but were forced to flee before taking the ring when nearby villagers rushed to her aid. The villagers carried her, unconscious, back to Brougham Hall, where her friends tended to her, and she was sufficiently recovered the next day to be returned to Burton Agnes. She did not rally for long though, never rising from her sickbed and becoming weaker by the day. As she lay dying, she shared with her sisters that she would be unable to rest peacefully in a grave away from her home, and expressed her wish that her head be brought back to the hall, specifically stating that it should be placed on the table in the hall, and that on no account should it ever be removed, so that at least one part of her could remain in our beautiful home as long as it shall last. The sisters promised they would do so, but they went back on their word and interred their sister's entire body in the family tomb at the local church. Shortly thereafter, they were plagued with moans and weird sounds and other supernatural disruption at the hall, sufficient to drive them to consult the local priest about the problem. Having listened to their account of both their pledge to their sister and of the terrifying activity now plaguing them and their household, the priest suggested that the activity was likely due to them going back on their word and failing to fulfill Catherine's dying wish. He recommended that they retrieve her head as they had promised. When they disinterred her, they found that her head had somehow separated itself from her body, and her flesh had already fallen from it, leaving a bare skull. It's easy to postulate that they might have taken this as an affirmation that they were on the right track, and indeed, on taking it to the hall and placing it on the table as had been promised, they immediately found that the moans and noises stopped. Since then, there are a couple of accounts of the skull being removed from the hall. In one, a servant at some point took a dislike to the skull and decided to be rid of it, throwing it on the back of a passing wagon. Having done so, the horses reared and trembled in fear, the hall shook, and pictures fell off the wall, until the skull was retrieved and returned to the hall. Another time the skull was buried in the grounds, but Catherine once again made her displeasure known, and the hall rang with the unnatural sounds of wailing and moaning until she was restored to her rightful place, and peace returned to Burton Agnes. According to the Burton Agnes Hall website, the skull is still there today, securely bricked up in one of the walls to prevent it being removed ever again.
As we slowly inch our way down the country, we move now to Manchester, and from a screaming skull case with a clear-cut identity and origin story, to a case with not one, but 3 potential owners of the skull. At first glance, the tale around this skull may seem very convoluted and confusing, but as we investigate, we may just find that things aren't quite as complicated as they seem. Wardley Hall is only 6 miles away from the large city of Manchester in the northwest of England. Sandwiched between the busy M60 motorway on one side and a large industrial estate on the other, it might seem like an unlikely location for such a historic and storied place. But tucked between these 2 very urban landmarks is a densely wooded estate, and almost hidden at its centre is a 16th century manor house with a distinctive timber-framed exterior. A towering quadruple chimney stack rises dramatically from the slate roof, and the remains of a moat hint at a much earlier 14th century building, whose foundations now lie firmly buried beneath the building that we can see today. These days, Wardley Hall is known for being the official residence of the Roman Catholic Bishop of Salford, and running alongside almost the whole length of the estate is the extensive St Mary's Roman Catholic Cemetery. But there was a time when Wardley Hall had a rather more sinister reputation and was known across the country as the Skull House. The reputation started with local tradition, and tales about the hall thrived amongst local residents for generations. But the reason stories about Wardley still abound to this day is, like so many of our other cases, likely due to the historians, antiquarians, and other writers across the years who just couldn't resist publishing articles on the deliciously creepy legend. The first of whom seems to have been the Manchester antiquarian Thomas Barrett, who visited the hall in 1792 and gave an account of the curious artefact he discovered there. For on his visit, he became acquainted with Wardley Hall's most famous resident, a weather-bleached and smooth-worn skull that presided over all the manor's comings and goings from its place at the top of the stairs, from which, apparently, no one dared to move it. He wrote that the skull hath had a superstitious veneration paid to it, not permitting it to be removed from its situation, which is on the topmost step of a staircase. There is a tradition that, if removed or ill-used, some uncommon noise or disturbance always follows. And whilst Barrett may have been the first to write about the frightening consequences of angering Wardley's resident's skull, he certainly wasn't the last. By the time of Barrett's work, the skull seems to have become a well-respected, if a little feared, permanent resident of Wardley. But not every tenant of the hall felt so inclined. The Lancashire and Cheshire Antiquarian Society wrote in 1883 about an apparently well-known occurrence, implicitly accepted as the author states, during which one occupant of the hall tried to dispose of the skull by throwing it into the moat. According to the author, there followed unearthly noises that filled alike bold and timid with alarm, and continued until the water was run out of the moat and the discontented skull was fished up and replaced in triumph in its former situation. Of course, you may well imagine that being unceremoniously ousted from the house and thrown into the moat would perhaps understandably anger the skull, but more minor transgressions were also said to invoke its wrath. Barrett describes how the skull's customary place of repose left it exposed to weathering and bleaching from the light through an open window, which was always left open and unglazed in order to appease the skull. According to the tenants, if the window was blocked or shut up in any way, the skull would become unruly and disturbed. Our antiquarian, despite his obvious fascination, seems to have been rather unconvinced by the tales, or at least unafraid enough of retribution to put the legend to the test. During his visit, either he or one of his friends, and he's noticeably vague about exactly who the culprit was, moved the skull from its favourite place under the light of the window, took it to a dark part of the room, and left it there before ending their visit. He doesn't give any detail about how long the skull was displaced from its customary spot, and perhaps he never discovered exactly when it was that one of the staff or family realised the skull had been moved and returned it to its window. But he does state that during the night but one following, a great storm arose about the house. Lightning ripped across the sky and a ferocious wind tore down trees, leaving destruction in its wake. An event which could surely be said to fit the description of the uncommon or unearthly noises and disturbances rumoured to be caused by the angered skull. Barrett's father visited the area after the storm and saw the damage it had wrought firsthand, confirming that the storm really was as dramatic as reported. But Barrett remained unconvinced, pointing out that the storm may well have happened whether they had moved the skull or not. He has a valid point, but the resulting storm fit just too neatly with the legend, and Barrett admitted in his writings that his effort to debunk the legend of the Wardley Hall skull had inadvertently added more fuel to a fire that helped the tale burn brightly for many generations to come. And no writer picked up that particular torch more enthusiastically than John Roby in his book Traditions of Lancashire, Volume 2. Written 90 years after Thomas Barrett's visit to Wardley, Roby references the great storm that arose after the antiquarian and his chums deliberately moved the skull. But Roby focuses on the tale behind who the skull might belong to, and picks up the thread of a story told amongst the old locals concerning one of the Downs family who had possession of Wardley Hall from 1601 to 1760. And from this story, we can gather that the locals rather detested one particular generation of the Downs sons, a courtier of Charles II, who has been described as the most profligate of profligate, wasteful in riotous extravagance, and as having blazed out his youth and health in lavish voluptuousness. So, not well liked by anyone really, which made him the perfect villain character for Roby's retelling of how the legend of the skull came to be. In his version of events, the tale begins with our villain's sister, situated at Wardley Hall, wringing her hands in agony over her brother's misdeeds, for she knows that he has murdered a man in cold blood. Steaming drunk and proving a boast to his friends that he would slay the first person that crossed his path that night, he stuck to his word and ran his sword through an unlucky sailor who was very much in the wrong place at the wrong time. What tortures his sister perhaps more than anything is that he got away with the murder, having enough connections and favour at court to be able to cover up his terrible crime, leaving her with the weight of his unpunished sin upon her conscience. In the bleak hours of twilight, with this stain on the family honour leaving her haunted and restless, a horse arrives at the outer gate of the hall, startling her out of her reverie. fearing bad news, and always nervous and expectant at hearing that her brother's misdeeds have finally caught up with him. She was mildly relieved to discover that the horse only brought a package from London. But, looking upon it, a dirty wooden box fastened with rough twine and rusty nails, her relief faltered. And something about the package made her feel inexplicably uneasy. Already in low spirits and practically jumping at shadows, she decided to get herself to bed and deal with whatever the box contained in the warmer light of day. But her night was restless. The shadows of her bedroom flitted and danced, playing tricks on her unquiet mind, and when morning came, she found she still couldn't muster up the mettle to open the box. So instead, she instructed her staff to take it to an outbuilding where the sight of it could no longer unnerve her. She would soon find out, however, that it would not be so easy to put it out of her mind, as the box did not want to be forgotten. It was removed to an outbuilding as requested, but her odd instruction sparked the idle curiosity of the staff, who couldn't fathom why their mistress seemed so unnerved by the bland-looking package. Well, they were soon to find out for themselves when they heard a strange knocking sound coming from the outhouse in which they had just deposited the box. And on closer inspection, they realised that the knocking was, in fact, coming from inside the box. Now themselves horrified at what the dreaded package might contain, the tale of the unexplained noises spread like wildfire through the staff, swiftly making it back to the lady of the house herself, who realised that she would have to face her fears once and for all if she were to stop these rumours getting out of hand. The whole household held its breath as they watched their mistress head to the outhouse, wondering what would happen. But they were to remain unsatisfied, for she merely returned soon after, claiming, in an obviously false and slightly hysterical voice, that it was nothing but a box of straw. In fact, so unsatisfied were they with her explanation that one amongst the staff just couldn't sleep that night, and instead found himself whiling away the small hours gazing listlessly out of the window at the shadowy garden. Imagine his intrigue, then, when, on his impromptu midnight watch, he spotted none other than his mistress, creeping forth across the lawn to a huge old sycamore tree, a cloak wrapped around her shoulders. He looked on in wonderment and no slight horror as she dug a hole in the ground, pulled some bundle from under her cloak, dropped it in the hole, and filled it in, smoothing over all the evidence of her curious task. Of course, he was sorely tempted to go straight to the tree at break of day and discover the cause of her strange actions. But lack of opportunity and no small amount of fear prevented the man from uncovering her secret. Little did he know that the secret would uncover itself soon enough. For, as we've already learned, the thing in that package did not want to be forgotten, and neither did it want to stay buried. Soon enough, the mistress of the house would have to face her carefully concealed secret once more, and learn that she could not single-handedly cover up the stain that her brother had left on their family's honour. For the thing in that package had in fact been the disembodied head of her brother, with a scrawled note explaining how his immoral behaviour had finally caught up with him. The note read, "Thy brother has at length paid the forfeit of his crimes. The wages of sin is death, and his head is before thee. Heaven hath avenged the innocent blood he hath shed. Last night, in the lusty vigour of a drunken debauch, passing over London Bridge, he encounters another brawl, wherein, having run at the watchman with his rapier, One blow of the bill which they carry severed thy brother's head from his trunk. The latter was cast over the parapet into the river. The head only remained, which an eyewitness, if not a friend, hath sent thee. She had thought that by burying her brother's head and never speaking of him again, she might be able to cover up the truth about his death and crimes. But even in death, it seemed, her willful sibling would not rest. For one morning, after her clandestine inhumation of the skull, she mounted the stairs only to recoil in horror when she saw the outline of a human skull blocking the light from the window. Aghast, she couldn't believe her eyes, but sure enough, there was no mistaking it. Sitting in the window that was, in childhood, her brother's favourite spot, was his still gory head, scant hair and flesh stubbornly clinging to the bone. No longer able to keep her terrible secret, she spilled forth all the horror to her unwitting cousin Eleanor. I thought to hide this foul stain upon our house, to conceal it if possible from every eye, but the grave gives back her dead, the charnel gapes. That ghastly head hath burst its cold tabernacle and risen from the dust, without hands, unto its former gazing place. Thou knowest, Eleanor, with what delight, when a child, he was accustomed to climb up to that little eyelet hole, gazing out thereat for hours, and playing many odd and fantastic tricks through this loophole of observation. Thereafter, it seemed every attempt to return the cursed head to its grave, or by other means destroy it, was doomed to failure. They tried hiding it, burning it, smashing it, but every time the skull stubbornly reappeared on its favourite window, completely unharmed. On one occasion, a determined person attempted to hack it to pieces, but they, in turn, suffered horrible torments in their limbs, as though the action against the skull was being enacted back upon them. The actions in life and death of the last Downs male heir sealed his family's fate. His sister never truly recovered from her trauma, and the house fell out of the hands of the Downs family for good. The skull, however, remained. And so ends Roby's retelling, apparently based on an old local tradition explaining the origin story of the skull. His version of the story certainly made an impact, and it's still repeated right up to the present day as one potential version of how the legend of the skull came to be. The problem is that it's basically rubbish, and Roby knew it was when he wrote it. In fact, it seems that all of his contemporaries knew that Roby's stories, whilst based on a crumb of truth and a sprinkling of history, were heavily fictionalised. A biography of Roby included in one publication of his traditions alludes to this fact when talking about his writing method. In the production of these tales, Mr. Roby's practice was to make himself master of the historical groundwork of the story and, as far as possible, the manners and customs of the period, and then to commence composition. In these traditions, his great creative power is conspicuous. It seems, though, that this detail may have been forgotten by subsequent generations, and the fact that his story has some foundations in real people, real places, and were based, albeit fairly loosely, on local folklore, was just enough to get his version of events inextricably interwoven with the real history over the years during which the legend continued to be retold. The result being that, quite often, at least some parts of his account were misquoted as truth, and the story has become a muddy amalgamation of facts and fictions.
The truth is that there really was a much-loathed male heir of the Downs family of Wardley Hall, who, by all accounts, misspent his youth and his inheritance and came to an untimely end in the summer of 1676 at the hand of a constable's watch. In Roby's story, his character is Harry Downes and his sister Maria, but the real-life Downes was named Roger and his sister Penelope. Why he changed their first names for his tale isn't clear, but it is true that Roger Downes found himself a violent death. A letter written by a contemporary a week after the altercation that ended his life described the events. According to the writer of the letter, Downes and his gang had been out making trouble of a night, and eventually ended up at the door of the local constable, whereupon the group broke down the door and attacked the officer. The constable's watch was summoned and a fight ensued, during which Downes lost his sword. The lack of weaponry didn't deter him, however. He simply grabbed a stick and carried on swiping at the law enforcers. As you can imagine, this didn't do him much good, and eventually the watch brought him down, running into his side with a half pike and whacking him over the head with a spittle staff, whatever one of those is. I couldn't turn up anything more about it, so if anyone knows, answers on a postcard, please. In the account given by the writer, he doesn't seem to have died at the scene, but can't have lasted very long afterwards, as the letter begins with the proclamation, "Mr. Downes is dead." So, there was a Mr. Downes who died in a fight in London, and he was a rather nasty character. But you will have noticed by now that he definitely didn't get his head cut off. A fact that John Roby must have known full well, bearing in mind he drew inspiration from Thomas Barrett's account, which itself explores the possibility of the origin of the story of the skull as being that of Roger Downes, and also debunks it. It turns out that in 1779, just a few years before Barrett's visit to Wardley, the family vault at the Downes at Wigan Church had been opened, and not being able to ignore the curiosity surrounding the old local folktale of the Wardley Hall skull, the remains of Roger Downes were examined, and it was found that his skull was definitely still attached to his shoulders, and certainly not gracing a window at Wardley Hall. There is a small however to this revelation though, because the details given to Barrett revealed that the skull of Roger Downes, while still attached to his spine, had been sawn off just above the eyes. We have no explanation as to why this might have been, apart from maybe a post-mortem autopsy. Although, bearing in mind he was bashed over the head with a staff and run into with a pike, one would imagine his cause of death would be fairly obvious. I have to wonder though if this odd fact about part of his skull being missing was a key element in the legend becoming attached to Roger Downes in the first place, in addition of course to the fact that he was a much loathed character, making him the perfect villain for the tale. So, if not Downes, then who does the skull belong to? Well, another popular explanation tells a very different tale indeed, one of a well-meaning but unfortunate priest who angered his master. This story, told to Barrett by an acquaintance who claimed that the tradition could be traced back more than a century and was known to no less than 3 generations of a long-lived local family, tells the tale of another Lord of Wardley who was called away on urgent business at a time that his wife was pregnant and expecting any time. He left a priest to care for his wife at Wardley, and the priest, trying to fulfill his duty and look after the lady's health, recommended she have a hot bath. Apparently, this bath caused her to catch a cold, which sadly took her life before her husband could return home. On discovering the priest's recommendation, he placed his anger and blame for her death squarely on the poor man's shoulders, and liberated his head from those very same shoulders in short measure. Now, this may seem an even more unlikely tale than that of the Downes saga, Although, if nothing else, it does tell us that people apparently had a powerful aversion to baths in the 1700s, but the tale does have a small grain of truth to it, inasmuch as the mysterious skull did belong to a priest. Barrett presents this third possible origin story for the skull alongside the others, and writes that an acquaintance of his assured him that the skull belonged to a Romish priest who was executed at Lancaster for seditious practices in the time of William III. He was most likely the priest at Wardley, to which place his head being sent might be preserved as a relic of his martyrdom. Now, Barrett's acquaintance got his timeline wrong, but aside from that, we're finally onto something. You see, quite aside from the local folklore that had grown up around the skull, we have a very interesting account in the 1908 publication The History of Wardley Hall about the discovery, or I should more correctly say rediscovery, of the skull in 1745. According to oral tradition, in that year Wardley Hall had been sacked by the troops of Charles III during the Jacobite Rising, and the tenant of Wardley Hall, at that time a Matthew Morton, had fallen on hard times. So, in order to produce a much-needed income, he made the decision to pull down a ruinous part of the building to make space to install weaving looms. The wall he pulled down is thought to have once formed part of the old chapel, and as the demolition commenced and the old wall broke and crumbled, a casket was spotted falling from within the wall, where presumably it had lain hidden for years. Of course, as they always do in these stories, the onlookers had high hopes of finding treasure, but alas, it was not to be. What they found inside was in fact a skull, grinning from a full set of teeth and furnished with a good deal of auburn hair. The most interesting part is this statement within the account. This was the skull now reverently enshrined on the staircase at Wardley Hall. The impression of the Mortons was that the skull was that of an executed papist, to which faith the former owners of Wardley belonged. So now we can see that at the time of its rediscovery in 1745, the skull was from the very first assumed to be that of a Catholic priest, executed for his faith. His skull kept safely hidden away as the relic of a martyr for decades by a family apparently known to have followed the Catholic religion. A baton clearly picked up by Matthew Morton, who evidently had no compunction about giving the skull a revered seat within the house and continuing its safekeeping. What makes this one of the more unusual Screaming Skull cases is that we can go even further than that, because that head of auburn hair still present on the skull in 1745 was a huge clue as to who the skull belonged to, and it pointed quite directly to a priest named Father Ambrose Barlow.
Ambrose, whose real name was Edward, was a member of the Order of Saint Benedict, a monastic order of the Catholic Church, which was a pretty risky occupation in the 17th century. He was born near Manchester to a Catholic family who reluctantly converted to the Church of England during the outlawing of Catholicism. But it seems that the family never really relinquished their religion. Ambrose's grandfather and father were punished for refusing to conform to the new religion, and Ambrose was set to follow in their footsteps. In his later years, he secretly conducted Mass for an underground community of staunch Catholics, all the while having to plan and navigate a careful routine that would help him avoid the attentions of Protestant authorities, splitting his time between parishioners in the vicinity of Morley's Hall in Lancashire and, importantly for us, his cousins at Wardley Hall. The period from 1559, when Catholic Mass was made illegal under the rule of Elizabeth I, right up to the Catholic Emancipation and Relief Acts in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, was a very dangerous time for priests like Ambrose Barlow. There were periods within this time frame that Catholicism was grudgingly tolerated or under slightly less pressure, but for the most part, Barlow's occupation was one that could see him put on trial for treason. Unfortunately, in the year 1641, tensions between the king and Parliament were high. England was on the brink of civil war, and in an effort to avert this and ease rising tensions, Parliament passed a bill requiring an oath called the Protestation Oath to be signed by all adult citizens over the age of 18, declaring their loyalty to Protestantism, Parliament, and to King Charles. It was assumed that failure to sign the oath would expose Catholic recusants, but in reality, many Protestants refused to sign as well, and it did nothing to unite the population. Tensions continued to rise, eventually resulting in the start of the English Civil War, and the whole affair brought the Catholic recusants back under scrutiny. Maybe this was why Father Ambrose Barlow, despite having managed to fly under the radar of the Protestant enforcers for years, unfortunately found himself on trial in 1641, ending in him being executed by hanging, drawing and quartering, his head cut off and mounted on a pike as a warning to others. He never denounced his faith whilst in prison or on trial, so after his death he was considered to be a Catholic martyr and eventually canonised, becoming Saint Ambrose Barlow. His head is long believed to have been rescued from its public display by Francis Downes, who became Lord of Wardley Hall upon inheriting the manor in 1638. Francis Downes and his wife came under scrutiny themselves in 1641 when they refused to sign the Protestation Oath declaring their allegiance to King Charles and the Church of England. They were recorded in the Lancashire Protestation Return as recusants, and as punishment was stripped of all weaponry except for a single case of pistols for self-defence. We can see why, then, that the family at Wardley Hall might have seen fit at some point during the proceedings to wall up the skull of their Catholic martyr and hide the relic away in the safety of the Wardley Chapel walls, because these religious tensions were to rumble on for many, many years after this. All this did lead me to wonder why such wildly different explanations for the skull ever arose upon its rediscovery in 1745. But then, even at that stage, over 100 years after Father Barlow's execution, it was still a very dangerous time to be a Catholic. The last known punishment of a Catholic priest with life imprisonment was as late as 1767. So it makes sense to me why the tenants of Wardley Hall might not have wanted to shout about the truth behind the skull. In fact, it might have been rather convenient for them if an alternative, less potentially inflammatory story started to circulate amongst the locals, a story that provided a welcome distraction from the contentious topic of religion. If there were any remaining doubt as to whose shoulders the skull once graced, these were as positively laid to rest as they ever could be by a couple of examinations of the skull. The first took place in 1931 at Manchester University. The skull was compared to surviving portraits of Ambrose Barlow and Barlow's father, and found to fit the age and features of the man, with no reason to doubt that the correct identification had been made. A second examination at St Bartholomew's Hospital, London, was made between 1959 and 1960, and they were able to make some even more interesting observations as well as confirming those made in the 30s. One of which was that the skull had never been buried. The report reads, "The specimen reveals no trace of soil or of other foreign matter within its numerous natural crevices and cavities. It displays no markings by grass or tree roots, and nowhere is its outer osseous table weathered or disintegrated in the manner characteristic of long-buried crania. On the contrary, the Wardley Hall skull presents an intact outer surface, smooth and somewhat polished as though from repeated handling. Well, so much for Roby's tale of repeated burial, eh? The second is that due to widespread and obvious fracture evidence inside the skull, the team could confirm that the skull had most definitely been displayed on some kind of sharp implement, like a pike. So sorry, Roby, but I think we can positively once and for all lay the Roger Downes story to rest. The thing is, though, is that we've had all this information for years, but the Roger Downes story, just like the skull at the centre of it, refuses to stay buried. Why is that? Of course, as with the case at Calgarth Hall, none of these revelations necessarily call into question the paranormal phenomena that's been reported to occur around the skull. So maybe it's just easier to attribute the supernatural activity to the much-loathed Roger Downes than it is to a martyred priest. Or maybe it's just that, for all his faults, John Roby did write a very evocative, very spooky tale, and at the end of the day, none of us can resist a wonderfully spooky ghost story. So, after starting this case with the classic maligned spirit trope and the fittingly villainous character of Roger Downes, we finish with another skull that's actually proven out to be a loved and revered member of the household, a precious relic, one that demands a certain respect and likes things a particular way, certainly, but I don't think it would be a great stretch to include this case in the rapidly amassing collection of skulls that at their heart appear to be some kind of household talisman. Which brings us neatly to our final case, one that we couldn't possibly miss out, and probably the most famous and widely covered case of them all, the case of Dickie, the skull of Tunstead Farm.
The case of Dickie of Tunstead Farm in the Peak District of Derbyshire seems to have a little bit of every screaming skull theme we've so far encountered, including both vengeful poltergeist activity as well as helpful, friendly and mischievous antics. Add to that the confusion and different supposed identities of the skull, and you really do have the lot. Dickie's skull has famously watched over the Coombs Valley from the window of Tunstead Farm for many generations, and, as long as left undisturbed and offered respect, was felt to be a welcome addition to many occupiers of the farm. In fact, in 1790, a tenant of the farm shared that the skull had been at the farm for at least 2 centuries already. So famous was Dickie that in the 1800s, visitors to the area could pick up a postcard showing a photograph of Dickie's skull on his preferred windowsill. Dickie is said to be quite a polite house guest, often opening doors for others, harnessing horses ready for a journey, warning of burglaries, and even once roused a farmer from his sleep in order that he could rescue a cow being strangled by its chain. As summarised by a witness in John Hutchinson's Tour Through the High Peak of Derbyshire, published in 1807, many good offices have been done by the apparition at different times. He even mentions he could produce 50 persons within the parish who has seen an apparition at this place. So it seems Dickie was also more than happy to appear in spectral form as well as lend an unseen hand to the occupants of the house. Dickie wasn't entirely beneficent though, as the same local witness also reported that the skull had been removed twice in living memory, once during the rebuilding of the farmhouse, and once when it was interred in the chapel yard. But each time, to quote the witness, "There was no peace, no rest, It must be replaced. Although, sadly, they don't go into any detail as to what exactly occurred. The author Clarence Daniel, in his 1973 book Ghosts of Derbyshire, gave a more up-to-date summation of Dickie's reputation up to that point. Tenants of the farm who treated the skull with the proper respect found it a talisman against evil and misfortune, while those who handled it with abuse inevitably suffered ill effects. Other accounts do go into a little more detail though. As referenced in Hutchinson's book, the first time Dickie was moved was during the renovation or rebuilding of the farmhouse, and it was during these works that the skull was first discovered, buried within the wall below the window which later became his favourite place to rest. When removed from the wall, the skull was said to have wept and moaned, as well as caused furniture and ornaments in the house to move, until he was replaced. Dickie apparently also enjoyed a bit of fresh air. One of the window panes in his favourite spot would regularly be found undamaged on the ground outside in the mornings, even after repeated reglazing. Dickie kicked up even more of a fuss when at one point he was interred in the local churchyard. It was said that afterwards a great storm occurred, cattle died and other livestock fell sick, in addition to the mysterious crying and moaning heard inside the farm itself. On another occasion it said that Dickie was cast into the nearby Coombs Reservoir, an action which evidently infuriated the skull, as it was reported that this caused all the fish in the reservoir to die. And I don't envy whoever was sent in to recover it that time. We even have reports that Dickie was once abducted by thieves, but his abductors were so terrified by the activity that accompanied him that they returned him forthwith. The owners of Tunstead were likewise relieved, as they reported that there had also been a commotion at the farm during his absence. Perhaps the most astonishing activity attributed to Dickie, though, was when he caused a railway to be rerouted. The North Western Railway Company wished to create a line that passed through lands belonging to Tunstead Farm, which Dickie seems to have taken offence to, perhaps due to spoiling the view across the valley from his windowsill. The railway company attempted several times to build a bridge on the land, but each morning when the workmen returned to continue their previous day's work, they would find it collapsed. And on one occasion the collapse buried all of the workmen's tools along with it. After repeated collapses, the company gave up and moved the line, restoring peace to Dickie's valley view. The new bridge was even locally known as Dickie's Bridge. The author Crichton Porteous was so inspired by all the tales of Dickie's activities that he even wrote a play about him titled Bachelor Love and Dickie's Skull in 1960. Due to this, I was nearly forced to discount another anecdote that was attributed to him, as I couldn't be certain that it wasn't apart from this artistic work. However, I later found that Crichton had actually first shared the locally known tradition in his 1950s non-fiction book on and titled Derbyshire. This story told of the farmer and his wife returning tired after a day at the local market. The farmer's wife, exhausted, went to open the gate and said, "I wish Dickie would open 'em," which apparently Dickie then did, as well as all the remaining gates leading to the house. Instead of being thankful for this, however, the farmer's wife was terrified and nearly didn't make it back to the house without fainting. If only we could all have such a helpful spirit at home. Now, this may seem like something so unlikely that it belongs in a play, but local historian Margaret Bellhouse, who lived in the neighbouring village of Coombs all her life, shared a similar story. She confirmed in an interview in 1993 that she remembered the owner of Tunstead Farm from her childhood, and recalled him talking about how, when going up the drive in a horse and trap, he would often find that the gates would swing open by themselves. She reports that the owner used to say, if you were good to Dickie, believed in him, and didn't say stupid things about him, he was good to you. So it seems that, at least within the farm, Dickie was respected and considered to be a kind of guardian. The other locals of the village were very superstitious, and their superstition spread to the whole farm. According to Margaret Bellhouse, nobody liked to go near the farm after dark, and to add more fuel to the supernatural tales, many residents encountered a strange black dog that would follow them down the main road before vanishing into the hill. Apparently, Margaret actually saw this curious apparition for herself. As is seeming to be the case with a lot of these skulls, there are at least two contenders to be its former occupant. The first is Ned Dixon, fitting neatly with the skull's long-held nickname of Dickie, who was said to have left the farm to fight in either the Huguenot Wars or the English Civil War. But whichever it was, fortunately he survived and returned home to Tunstead Farm. Less fortunately, however, to find that his cousin, or in some versions his brother, presuming Ned had perished in the war, had moved in with his wife. Not wanting to surrender the farm, the pair of them murdered poor Ned and buried the body under a flagstone in the hearth. Only Ned refused to stay buried, and his head pushed its way up through the earth, even managing to displace the heavy flagstone in order to reach the surface again, all the while punishing them with misfortune on the farm. After several attempts to rebury the skull, all with similar outcomes, they found peace only when Ned's skull was placed on the landing windowsill. Interestingly, the Dixon family did indeed live at Tunstead Farm for several generations, over approximately 300 years, up until the end of the Second World War. Whilst this might initially seem to bolster the Ned Dixon claim, the historical record implies that the Dixons were not resident there during the Huguenot Wars, which may be why other versions switched to the Civil War instead, although even then it's quite a close-run thing. There's even evidence that the Ned Dixon story was an invention, presumably by the Dixon family in the late 18th or early 19th century to draw tourists to the farm. Even some of the Dixon family themselves seem to have been sceptical of the skull being that of Ned, as in the early 1900s, the wife of the then owner Edward Dixon believed the skull to be that of the other claimant to the Dickie legend. But what's even more curious about this is that Mrs. Dixon was offered £100 for the skull, but refused to part with it. It's difficult to tell because of the slightly vague date, but from a quick search, in the early 1900s the sum of £100 could have been worth anywhere in the regions of £5,000 to £13,000 in today's money. That's a lot of money to pass up for an old skull, so Dickie must have held some importance in the owner's eyes. This second claimant is mentioned in a few sources, but there's much less to go on. In most cases they're an unnamed woman, but in some she has the surname Dickinson, presumably to tie in to the Dickie name. This woman and her sister supposedly shared the tenancy at Tunstead Farm, and were both enamoured of the same man. Desiring both farm and suitor for herself, one sister killed the other. The story gets even more vague here, as the dying woman in her last breath demands that her body must remain at the farm, proclaiming that her bones would never rest in any grave. Stay it does, and over the years the rest of the skeleton is somehow lost, leaving only the skull. Yet another variation of this tale is a little less macabre. This time the sisters live peacefully in the house until one passes away, though again she shares a desire for her skull to remain at the farm after death. The surviving sister promises that it will be so, but goes back on her word and has her buried at the local churchyard in her entirety. Having done so, all hell breaks loose at the farm until she honours her promise and has the skull dug up and returned to Tunstead. As we've encountered with so many of these local traditions, it seems that this last revision may be cross-pollinated from yet another story, as it shares a number of similarities with the skull legend from Burton Agnes Hall. Sadly, unlike Catherine at Burton Agnes, Dickie seems to no longer be in residence at Tunstead Farm, or at least several curious historians and researchers have reported so on asking the current owners. It is possible that they simply grew tired of people turning up hoping to see Dickie and threw the skull out, or maybe they just told people they did for the peace and quiet. Local rumour suggests that they buried the skull in the garden, and I wonder how Dickie responded to that if true.
So despite Dickie being probably the most famous and widely written about case, it actually ends up being one of the cases in which we know next to nothing about who its true owner might be. Although we did find a small clue that may take us all the way back to the beginning of the episode and the revelation that the skull of Bettiscombe Manor is actually likely to be that of a Bronze Age woman originally buried in one of the tumuli atop Pilston Pen Hill Fort. Well, it turns out that Tunstead Farm, nestled as it is at the base of a hill, sits directly underneath a rise, upon which sits a prehistoric stone circle. This stone circle is not very well known. In fact, it's not even marked on my beloved Ordnance Survey maps. It's never been properly excavated, so we don't really know what lies beneath its surface, but it is documented as a known prehistoric site of importance in historical records. We struggled to find any details about the site, but then we stumbled upon this tantalising little nugget from the Derbyshire Historic Environment Record, referring in part to a brief investigation of the site conducted by a Mr. Andrew in 1910. Vestiges of a small circle on the hillside above Tunstead and Cadster House adjoining the lane from Coombs to Fernley were pointed out by Mr. Andrew in 1910. It had then been almost obliterated by cattle, etc., but the general outline could still be traced. A trepanned skull called Dickie, now at Tunstead Farm, may have come from this tumulus. This tiny scrap of information brings a whole new aspect to Dickie's story. Could the skull really belong to another Bronze Age inhabitant whose burial mound had been disturbed? There are a couple of very grainy black and white photographs of Dickie's skull available to view, but there isn't much of the skull left, and it's almost impossible to see from the angles at which the shots were taken whether the skull does in fact bear a hole where the skull was trepanned. It wouldn't be unusual for a prehistoric skull to bear such a mark, and it's something that could easily be misidentified in later years for a wound that maybe led to the recipient's murder, and perhaps helping to spawn the variety of stories about where the skull had come from. All we really know is that the skull was discovered already interred in the walls of the farmhouse, possibly sometime in the 16th century. So was it put there deliberately, many years before, as a talisman like some of the other skulls we've discovered on our journey, a guardian spirit of the house? If so, Dickie seems to have taken this role very seriously, and across many centuries, through wars, religious and political upheaval, steadfastly gazing out from his or her window and looking after the farm. I like to hope that the tenants of Tunstead Farm have simply chosen to retire Dickie from public view, and that they haven't actually buried the most famous screaming skull of them all.
And that brings us to the end of our exploration into the world of screaming skulls. It's been quite a journey, from the vengeful ghosts of the 19th and 20th century stories to the possibilities of prehistoric guardian spirits. Of course, we couldn't possibly delve into every screaming skull story out there, not in one episode at least, and there are so many more skulls with their own stories to tell across Britain, more themes to explore, more secrets to discover, and hopefully one day we can tell some more of their stories, and maybe even get to visit them for ourselves. We hope that you've enjoyed coming along with us on this spooky adventure, and that you'll join us again on the next episode of Knock Once for Yes. Kind of wanted to read Dorothy's curse.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, that was quite fun, actually. Would it make you feel better if you just did it now anyway?
Maybe.
Go on then.
Guard thyself, Miles Phillipson. Thou thinkest thou hast managed grandly, but that tiny lump of land is the dearest a Phillipson has ever bought or stolen. For you will never prosper, neither your breed. Whatever scheme you undertake will wither in your hand. The side you take will always lose. The time shall come when no Phillipson will own an inch of land, and while Calgarth wall shall stand, we'll haunt it night and day. Never will ye be rid of us.
Yeah, you probably should have read that, actually.